Hi. So I'm thrilled to be here with Allison Pataki. We have actually not met before today. And so I had the pleasure of reading Finding Margaret Fuller and just falling in love so completely.
Thank you.
I have probably way too many questions for the allotted time, but I also would like to save some time at the end if possible, if anyone has some questions. So just be prepared for that, because there's always that lull at the end of it where it's like, does anyone have any questions? And they're like, I didn't know I had to think of any. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But let's start by talking about, before we jump into the book, your career trajectory.
Yeah.
You started in journalism.
Yeah.
Did you think that was where you were going to live your entire life? Or did you always want to do fiction?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being in conversation with me, and thank you all for being here. There are so many amazing programs, so thank you for giving me some of your time. And this is my first time being at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, and I am in love with it. I can see why it is the best Writers Festival in the country, right? That's the official name.
Yes, according to
I'm thrilled
Jamie, that is
to be
the
here
official
with
name.
all of just such an enthusiastic group of readers. It's really, I've been editing in my cave for months, not seeing sunlight because I'm from upstate New York. So to see readers and to see sunshine, this is like, 24 hours of bliss. But to answer your question, so prior to writing historical fiction, I've always loved stories. I've always been intrigued by a great story. I've always asked really personal, inappropriate questions from anyone I speak with, just because I always want to get at what the heart of the story is, whatever the context. And so I've also really always loved history. And growing up in upstate New York, right across from West Point, the region of the world that George Washington referred to as the key to the continent, there's all this really rich colonial and beyond era history. Like, you can't drive a quarter of a mile in any direction without bumping into some historical marker. And we always break for historical markers. And I just really seeped that up, and I really love history. So I thought the perfect blend would be journalism and news. And so when I was in college at Yale, I was the on-campus college reporter and the news anchor. And I did my first summer, college internship at ABC News in New York. And I graduated college. I started my job in news at ABC. And coming from being an English major at Yale and just really loving dorking out and reading everything I could as an English major, I get to news, and my boss sits me down a few weeks into the job, and he's like, so you need to use shorter sentences. Any sentence that necessitates a comma, you have already lost the viewer. And you need to be more cynical, and you need to be snarkier. And I was told in one editorial meeting that the goal was to provoke outrage, because that is going to get the viewer hooked, and they're going to want to keep watching hour after hour, the 24-hour news cycle, to just sort of satiate that feeling. And I just thought, I don't want to do any of this. Right. And no disrespect to all of the wonderful media people who are here, but for me, the newsroom was not the right fit. And that was pretty clear to me pretty early on. But I remember, since we're coming up on March, I remember a few months into my job, I got assigned on St. Patrick's Day a longer form story about the traditions of St. Patrick's Day. Like, why do we look for gold at the end of the rainbow? Why do we talk about leprechauns? And I was like, I am inappropriately excited to research leprechauns and rainbows right now, but really it was the opportunity to dig into something a little bit deeper than just churning out the news bulletins 24/7 and just doing the frantic live TV news alerts. And so I just thought, I love writing, I love stories, I love investigating and storytelling, but I think I need to find another medium in which to do it. News writing is so different from fiction writing. So in my free time, I started to just go home, sort of as therapy, as sort of the release at the end of the day at the newsroom. I just pulled out my computer and I started writing fiction. And I started with short stories, and then I started just writing the story of my grandmothers, who had incredible stories during World War II and the Great Depression, because you always start with what you know. And I just started, I'm not professionally trained in writing fiction at all, but I just started to go get myself into it. And I just fell so in love with it. And I just thought, that is actually what I want to be doing. That's the writing I want to be doing. So I have all these things that are sitting on my computer that never would be published. They're not good, but they were my way in.
That's what I was going to ask, actually. Yeah. Did that become your first book?
It was my first book, and it was the first book through which I got my literary agent, and she came on, Lacey Lynch, to rep that first book. And then I'm in my editorial meetings to pitch this manuscript, and I was sitting at the Simon & Schuster meeting, and my agent had prepped me. She said, it was the Great Recession, it was '08. She said, no one wants to take a chance on an unknown first-time unpublished author. They are very jittery. It had been the writer's strike, and then it was the Great Recession. The economy was awful. It's not a good time to be trying to break in as a writer in news or in fiction. But she said, so be prepped for the question of what else you're working on, because they want to know it's like a better long-term investment to work with you. So I knew I wanted my next book. Again, they always say you write what you know when you're first starting out. I alluded to this in the beginning, but I'm from the Hudson Valley, and I'm from this area that's so rich with history. I was working on the story of Benedict Arnold's wife, because everyone, I don't know if it's as big in California as it is in New York, but everyone knows Benedict Arnold was the traitor. He tried to end the American Revolution. He tried to betray George Washington. But nobody knows about the role his wife played in the whole thing. And it was this fascinating, salacious love triangle with the British spy that he was conspiring with. And I fell in love with this story, and I fell in love with this way into the history through the woman, and through the woman's perspective. And so I got this question of, what else are you working on? And I was like, well, let me tell you about Benedict Arnold's wife, and this story is so good. And I just kept talking about that story. And then at the end of the meeting, she said, actually, I want to make an offer on that book. And, and my agent said, if you get an offer on a book, you take the offer on the book. We will revisit this story at another time.
In the drawer. We'll
yes,
go back to that.
And I have never gone back to that one, which is, I think it worked out exactly how it was meant to work out. But it was not a straightforward linear path.
That's great, though. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And for people who don't often understand how maybe that, a lot of people will get their agent on that first manuscript, but that's not the one that sells. Mm-hmm. It's usually the second one. Mm-hmm. But very rarely is someone pitching it in the room and they buy the second one. That's great. Okay, so Finding Margaret Fuller is your 10th novel.
Yes, that's my 10th.
We were just talking over there about how I don't know how you're so prolific, considering not only are you writing a book a year and raising a family and having your life, but also to write historical fiction, which requires the research to pull it off the way you do is just phenomenal. So 10th novel. And you seem to bounce around many different historical time periods. That's the other thing. She's not just like, well, I write World War II, that's what I do. So what was the seed of this story? What was your way in? Was it the Transcendentalists? Was it Concord set? Herself? How did it happen?
So my poor agent, every book has been a completely organic process. For those who were here for the Marjorie Post talk this morning, that was through a tip-off from a friend of a friend, and I just got fixated on the idea of this woman and just had to know everything about this woman, and I knew that that was my book. With Margaret Fuller, it was also totally organic and totally just a fluky piece of good luck. What happened was I had just published, had I published Marjorie Post? No, I had just finished final edits on Marjorie Merriweather Post, the book, and I had just had my third baby. And I have 3 daughters, and we live in New York, and so our family's kind of scattered all over the country, so a lot of the women of the tribe wanted to come in and meet the baby and just sort of see how things were going. And so they all came in, and it was Memorial Day weekend. And we had all these plans with the kids and the adults, and it rained the entire weekend, which is very atypical for the start of the summer in New York. And so everything we were planning to do got completely scrapped. And so we are all just sitting inside all weekend, full house. So many kids, newborn baby, hormones, everything's flying, it's starting to deteriorate rapidly. And so by like the 3rd day, my mother-in-law gives me this book, and it's titled American Bloomsbury. And it is about the genius cluster of Concord, Mass, in the mid-1800s that is sort of all built around Ralph Waldo Emerson's home and this colony of thinkers he is pulling to his side. So you've got this unique moment in time where Henry David Thoreau is living upstairs in Ralph Waldo Emerson's house as the handyman. You've got the Alcotts living just up the road in a house that Emerson is paying the rent on. You've got the Hawthornes living just up in the other direction in a house that is also an Emerson family home. Emerson hires Thoreau to put in Nathaniel Hawthorne's vegetable garden as a wedding present, and they are all just living there together, and it's like the first season of Friends, Americana style. But we all know
The
these
little more
names.
consumption.
Yeah, we all know these names, and we all read their work, of course, and this is like the foundation of the American canon. But what I had not known was that they were all living together, and they were friends, and they were rivals, and they were falling in and out of these flirtations and these passionate relationships with Louisa May Alcott, and had a crush on her tutor, who was Henry David Thoreau. And my mind was blown. But then there was an even deeper level to this like stunning discovery for me, which is that the woman at the center of it all, the woman who Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to as the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center of our circle, was this woman named Margaret Fuller. And I'm reading this book, and I know all about Emerson, I know about Thoreau, I know about Hawthorne. I had voluntarily gone to Concord in my life at a previous date and done the dorkiest history tour you can do, where you visit the Orchard House and Minuteman National Park. And even me, as someone who had sought out this history, I had never come across the name Margaret Fuller. And so just in reading this initial book, that's a biography about this group of friends, Nathaniel Hawthorne based Hester Prynne off of Margaret Fuller. She was walking the trails of Walden Pond with Thoreau as he's deciding whether or not to leave civilization behind and move out to the woods. Ralph Waldo Emerson saw her as his muse, and Hawthorne said that Emerson saw Margaret as his goddess, and he apotheosized her and saw her as the one woman alive worth considering. She was Louisa May Alcott's mentor. She was the first female international foreign news correspondent. She was Edgar Allan Poe's nemesis. That's what I was going to say. Edgar Allan Poe said, there is man, humanity can be divided into three categories. There's man, there's woman, and there's Margaret Fuller. And he was very nasty. He called her Margaret Fuller. But she was friends with Georges Sand, Frédéric Chopin. She was great. She was a writer for Horace Greeley. She covered Frederick Douglass. She was like everywhere, did everything. Served in the Roman Revolution. Just this mind-blowing, epic life story that reads like the stuff of legend. And yet, I had no idea who she was. She was also considered the founding mother and founding writer of the American women's rights movement and the suffrage movement for the women's right to vote. So I just thought, I need to know more about this woman. I have got to learn more about her life, and what a travesty that we don't know more about her, but I thought, I've met my next book. I have met my next woman. And there's always that moment where there's just sort of this outrage of, how do I not know about this woman? And then this moment of like, I've been bitten by this story, and this story's gotten its hooks in me, and this is what I need to devote my life to.
What you just said there was really interesting. You said, I found my next woman. Mm-hmm. Is that usually your entry?
That's how it goes, yeah. I just become totally obsessed, and then the woman starts just speaking to me and haunting me, and then I just want to know everything I can about her.
Well, okay, so this is my question is actually a craft question next, which is, I had the amazingly coincidental, remarkable experience of, for Audiobrary, which is my audio publishing company, we're doing a book on Thoreau right now. And I was in the booth, I was recording it, and it was about his spirituality and his connection to nature and his relationship with God. It's a really fascinating text called Thoreau's God.
Wow.
I walked out of the booth and was like, I need to read Allison's book for this event. And I sit down, and like page 1, he's a fictional character.
Exactly.
And you do this beautiful description of him as this sort of Pan-like satyr figure.
Yeah.
So my question is, what is your entry point to characterization of famous historical figures?
Yeah.
Like, how do you humanize them? Do you have a strategy? What's your in?
Yeah.
And when do you feel like you're ready to start committing it to paper?
Such a great question. Yeah, so there's this great quote that I'll paraphrase by E.L. Doctorow, where he says, the biographer will tell you what happened, the novelist will tell you how it felt. And that is really what I am going for. And that's why
felt like Goosebumps is what it felt like.
I love historical fiction because of that access you get as the reader into these moments of history, which are juicy and dramatic and compelling. You know, history is the furthest thing from boring, but we get to enter into them and be a fly on the wall and witness these scenes and witness, you know, the drama and the emotional truths of it. So for me, where it starts always, no matter what the context is or what the century or history is, just taking in as much as I can of the raw material, the straight up nonfiction, you know, I'm not going to read anything that's fictional about her because that's someone else's relationship to the material. So with Margaret Fuller, I was really fortunate in that she had written hundreds of pages herself of her own letters and memoirs and travel experiences, travel diaries. She'd written Woman in the 19th Century.
Is she archived somewhere? Like,
Yeah,
where are her papers?
you can get, they've all been put together. After she passed, Emerson and a few other writers compiled a lot of her papers together. Okay. And then because she published them in her lifetime, they are out there in the world as books. So hundreds of pages of her words was the entry point, for sure. I really got a sense of tone and her personality. Now, it's dense. We do not speak like that, the way Margaret did back in the day. One of her contemporaries said, I can read Hegel in the original German, Dante in the original Italian, and most impressive of all, Margaret Fuller in the native English. And so even in that time, it was florid, it was ponderous, it was very, very dense prose. But having that was really wonderful. And then her contemporaries as well, you can read in their own voices. So I did a ton of Thoreau, I did a ton of Emerson, read as much of Louisa May Alcott's work as I could and Hawthorne's as I could, just to really soak up the feeling and the texture of her world. And I put them all in the back of the book. Every sort of nonfiction book I read and every sort of document that I read. But then for me, it was about traveling also to the place. And that's always huge for me, is to walk in her footsteps. So I know, for instance, that when she would be passing through as this visitor to the Emerson home, causing all sorts of drama and disturbance in the household by being there, I know that she stayed in this one room and she liked to sit in this one chair and look out the window and see Emerson and Thoreau, you know, beneath the trees. You can actually go and see those places and feel them. But I will say, the Emerson home where she stayed most frequently when she was visiting Concord is a museum now, and it's preserved pretty much how the Emersons lived in it, except her room is the gift shop, which I took umbrage with. But I was like, isn't that emblematic? Yes.
Amazing.
But so researching, you know, I know she walked out to Walden Pond with Emerson and Thoreau, so I went and I walked out to Walden Pond, and just to sort of retrace her footsteps and soak it up. And Concord is really a town that honors and celebrates its history, so it's really accessible.
I have like 10
when
other
you're there.
questions about that, because I want
Everyone
to know how
should go
that
to
happened.
Concord, but not this time of year if you're in Palm Springs.
Right. I actually, for our
spring.
recording of Thoreau's God, I'm getting the author who lives in Concord to go out and just record ambient audio at Walden, so that we can like create almost like a meditation bonus feature for the audio.
That's beautiful.
But he was like, there's nothing going on right now.
Yeah.
Like, it's just snow. And
Yes.
it's like, okay, well,
Yes.
wait for it to thaw a
Go
little
once
bit.
the birds are going
get the
crazy.
bird song going.
Yeah, and the loons.
So, okay, to that end, because I think that's fascinating when you feel like you actually understand the character, especially through their own words. At what point in the writing process did you come upon the phrase that seems to encapsulate Margaret, which is the much that always wants more?
Yeah.
As the kids would say, she's a bit extra.
She was so extra. And it was even more extra to be extra as a woman in her day. And she really was. So Margaret was a genius from a very early age. That was very clear. And her father was very ahead of his time in that he recognized her precocious genius and decided he was going to raise her like a boy. And what that meant was he was going to educate her. She was speaking fluent Latin and Greek by the age of 5. She got in trouble at that age for sneaking this rag, this tawdry book into her room and reading it in her bed when her father couldn't see it, that she was not supposed to be reading because it was so beneath her, and it was the complete works of William Shakespeare. And her dad was like, how dare you read that trash? And she's 5. My 5-year-old is not reading the complete works of Shakespeare yet, but I would be just fine if she was. But she was really, really like this sharp, brilliant mind. And so eventually by high school, she leaves popular schooling altogether because she's smarter than the professors, and so it's a waste of her time in all-girls school. And so they live in Cambridge, Mass. in her youth. And so Margaret takes to posting up outside the gates of Harvard and inviting the Harvard lads to come and spar with her intellectually and engage with her in debates about history and Greek mythology and politics. She starts to get this reputation for being this precocious, extra, that Fuller girl. And so she's not traditionally college educated at the time, but when she's in her mid-20s, which is where we enter in with the story, she attracts the attention of Ralph Waldo Emerson when she writes a particularly, sharp op-ed, a eulogy actually dedicated to Emerson's brother. And he notices her and he invites her to come to this colony that he is starting out in Concord, where he really wants to establish for America this new country that's really only a few decades old, this new canon. They are free thinkers. They are breaking from the rigid dogma of Europe and the traditional church and sort of the old establishment. And they want to sort of launch this new literary, cultural revolution for America. And they become this group called the Transcendentalists. And they really all see Margaret. That's when he says she was the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center of this. And so when she plugs in with them, that's really, I think, when her life takes off as an intellectual and as this public thinker. And then she goes on to do amazing things. She then eventually becomes the first woman permitted to study at Harvard, and she eventually moves on from Concord and kind of outgrows that circle. And she says the problem with Concord is that it's lacking in discord. And, you know, as much as it was lovely to walk the woods with Thoreau and, you know, debate with Hawthorne and Emerson, she really wanted to engage with the world and get her hands dirty and cover the gritty realities of her time. So she moved to New York and took a job working for Horace Greeley. And there she was visiting orphanages and hospitals and at the time they were called insane asylums, but for really the people in society who had been forgotten and sort of pushed aside, she sat down and did extensive interviews with female prostitutes, and she wanted to hear their stories and tell their stories. And she really just shined the light right back on the rest of intelligentsia and was like, you know, you talk about opening your hearts, but she said, you talk about opening your purses, but what you need to do is open your hearts. And so she really was writing about sort of the underbelly of society and those who were being forgotten, and that's when she really sort of enters into this new era of being kind of a pioneer and a trailblazer.
And I think it's worth mentioning that she's doing all of this without any shield or security blanket in the form of a husband.
Yes.
And in the form of any kind of financial security, which is also something that sets her apart from maybe other polemic women of a time where they had some kind of financial autonomy. And one of the things, I was like, if this is true, this historical tidbit of so there's a recurring theme in this book of her doing work that these men are asking her to do. She's teaching for Bronson Alcott at his school, or if we can call it a school. She's editing and writing for Waldo at the Dial, and no one's paying her. So even her strongest, staunchest male allies, for some reason, and I'm asking you this question historically, what did they not get about the fact that she was trying to support her mother, her younger siblings? It seems like that assumption of female labor being free,
and it's
even for the men who are enlightened enough to understand that she's a genius, like what exactly was the problem?
Yeah, sadly it's true. Well, Bronson Alcott is a whole different ball of wax. You can read the book to see what was going on in Louisa May Alcott's family, because I don't want to spoil it, but that was just wild. And that I actually had to tone it down a little, because my editor was like, the problem is that any scene where Bronson Alcott is on the page, he is running away with it and things are getting so wacky that we need to bring it back to Margaret's trajectory. But so him not paying her was a whole debacle. But with Waldo too, so they decide, because they are so perceived as so radical and so free-thinking, these transcendentalists, that they decide they're going to start their own journal, their own magazine.
Because no one would publish them anymore.
Yeah, because they had gotten sort of pushed aside by the elite and the blue bloods, because they were writing about these radical things like, you can find God in nature and not just in the church pew. And they were doing these heretical things. So they start their own journal. And they see Margaret as their leader. So Margaret is their first editor. And she made history in being the first editor of a magazine. But the magazine's not making money. And that's fine for Waldo, because he has his deceased wife's trust fund. So he's living in this beautiful home with all the money, and he can be a thinker.
And planting a garden for Hawthorne.
He has that leisure. And Hawthorne can live, rent-free with his big sisters who cook him meals and slide him under the door while he toils away on his great oeuvre. That was and Thoreau can live upstairs in their house rent-free because he's a man. But Margaret can't live as a single unwed woman in another man's household. You know, that can't be done. So the material realities of her just survival and her provision and her being able to support her mother, her widowed mother, and younger siblings were always like an unavoidable and exigent fact of every decision she had to make. And so yeah, when Waldo didn't pay her, that was gutting. And you have this testimony of her trying to figure out how to ask. And this is Margaret. She is a powerful, strong woman. She will go head to head.
No, but it's like
with
women
Poe.
today who are like, how do I ask for a raise?
Exactly.
It felt like that, except it's actually existential.
Exactly. And so really when she gets to New York and she gets the job offer from Horace Greeley, and he pays her a man's salary, and he makes her his editor, that's a first for her.
He really became the hero of the book.
Really
in
was
a lot of ways.
a good partner for her.
Again, not a character I'd seen fictionalized in any capacity, and I was just, I'm Team Greeley.
Yeah,
Team
thank
Greeley.
goodness they connected. Yeah, and then he sends her to Rome. And then it gets crazy.
That is perfect, because I just looked down at my notes, and I was like, I have to say, I was fascinated by the section set in Rome.
Yes,
Love when that happens.
yes.
So walk me through that. So Margaret, as if she hasn't done enough, then becomes the first foreign war correspondent.
Yes, yes.
Not just female foreign war correspondent.
Full-time foreign war.
So Horace Greeley sends her to Italy to monitor what's going on there, because everyone knows they're heading towards war.
Yeah.
So I am not sure that I've actually read any historical fiction about the First Italian War of Independence.
Right.
And what's striking about these sections is that it feels so recent when so much of the rest of history in Rome is ancient.
Right.
So it feels so immediate. What did you know about that time period or that subject?
So great, so great. So to bring it back to the nickname that you mentioned, Margaret being the much that always wants more, a common refrain for her is she got restless. She also always equated herself with a bird who would fly the world and never find a branch to land on. So she's always looking for the next challenge. So Greeley identified that she was restless in New York. She wanted more. And so he offers her this position to go to Europe, and there are big things happening in Europe, and he hires her to cover the news stories in Europe, eventually making her way to Rome. So she stops first in London, where she befriends the poet laureate William Wordsworth, as you do when you're passing through London, right? And they have a little, they have an interlude there. And then she goes on to Paris, where she befriends Georges Sand and Frédéric Chopin, and she really finds a kindred spirit in Georges Sand, because Georges Sand is living with her lover, Frédéric Chopin, out of wedlock. It is a scandal. She wears pants, which is so scandalous. And Margaret sees that in Paris, not only is Georges Sand tolerated for this behavior, but she is celebrated. And so Georges Sand really helps nudge Margaret along the way towards stepping into her iconoclasm and her power and her independence as a woman. And then Margaret arrives in Rome, but she makes her way there as a governess, as a tutor, because again, she, as a single unwed woman, is not allowed to travel in Europe without the cover of a male chaperone. When she gets to Rome, she feels like she has arrived to the place that is speaking to her soul. The passion and the art and the history and the culture bring her soul alive. And she said, you know, only in Rome can one really experience Rome. And she really felt that way. And she leaves this family that she's been traveling under their respectable cover. And they're carrying on to go to Germany. She says, I'm gonna stay in Rome. And she puts roots down as a woman, living by herself. And it's at that time that the Roman people are rising up and calling for independence they have basically been traded back and forth over the centuries between the Austrians, the French, and the Pope. And so at that time, the Roman identity is really congealing and forming, and they declare that they will be a free republic. Now, Margaret, being a patriotic American who, you know, has grown up out of Massachusetts soil, really identifies with this cry for freedom and independence, and she's desperately writing back to the Americans and saying, we should support the Romans. This is a revolution, much like what we fought. And there really wasn't that much interest from the rest of the world in what was going on in the Roman Revolution. But they have this brief, glorious moment where the Roman Republic is declared. Margaret falls in love with a soldier, a Roman count, who leaves his aristocratic roots to take up with the revolutionaries. I said in the beginning that she's the inspiration for the character of Hester Prynne. Now, Hester Prynne is a beautiful, bold, brazen brunette who has a child with her lover out of wedlock. So something happens with Margaret where her life inspires the character of Hester Prynne when her friend Nathaniel Hawthorne is back in Massachusetts, is reading about Margaret's updates from Rome. But Margaret takes up with this countess, this Italian count, and they have this brief moment of glory, in the Republic. And then tragically, they are crushed by the soldiers of, the armies and the empires of the French and the Austrian and the Pope together. And what was chilling was, so I did not really know about this moment. I feel like we learn in school about Giuseppe Garibaldi, unification and Risorgimento, and that's a little bit later. This is sort of the prelude to that. This sort of paves the way for that. But this is Mazzini, and this is sort of before Garibaldi. So I hadn't really learned a ton about this before studying Margaret, but what was eerie for me was I was writing this and researching this at the exact same time that Russia was invading Ukraine, and as you said, it feels recent and it felt timely, and then my early advanced readers were having the same response, like, oh, this feels like the news, that, current events that were happening. But so it's this very tragic moment in Italian history, but Margaret really took up like the identity and the cause of the Roman Revolution.
How much material was there on the Count and her? Because if she wasn't writing back about it, because she was pretty secretive about what was going on, and then she's lost, how much do you know about? Because I found it fascinating that this woman who had been the muse to all of the, chose ultimately a man who couldn't even read her in English.
Yes, isn't that fascinating?
Who couldn't even understand her writing, didn't have that connection, just fell in love with her as a woman, clearly, but not as an intellectual.
Oh, I have the chills, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was like, more of that, please.
Yeah.
But what do you know, what was even documented about that relationship, considering she wasn't sharing the information with people?
It was almost like the courtship that had to be carried out in the language that was not her first language to make it an equal playing field, because otherwise no man could have been, on her level.
A very interesting point.
But so she wrote so extensively back because of her articles for the Tribune about everything about her life in Rome and the revolution and what she saw on the streets and what she saw with the soldiers and the parades and the troops. She just left out for a while the detail about taking this count as her lover and having a child with him. But then eventually she writes these long, newsy letters home a year after she has had this baby. And it's like, hey, Mom, so this thing happened while I was in Italy. There's this one update. She wrote a letter to her mother, and she wrote a letter to Emerson.
Right.
And
Math
she
has
knew
been
they
great.
would be
the gelato
shocked.
is fantastic. Also, I have a baby.
There's this guy. But what happened was when the Roman Revolution failed, they had to flee because the other, armies came in, and her husband was on the no-fly list. And so they fled to Florence and kind of had to hide under the radar. And she became best friends with Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So it's like everywhere she goes. And that was another great story, too.
Oh, that's so good.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning is another scandalous woman.
But I love, I think I was pestering you about that. I was like, I could read an entire book about Georges Sand and
I know,
EBB.
these great women.
Okay. It's a spoiler, but it's not really because it's on the first page.
Okay, if it's on the first page, then
I mean, and I guess history, we can't really spoil history so much. Margaret had a very short life, sadly.
Tragic death.
Tragic death, which she kind of weirdly foresaw.
And that was true. She had those recurring dreams her whole life.
Of drowning.
Of drowning, and her husband, the Count, had a prophecy in his family that any Giuseppe and any Osili was his last name, not his first name, any Osili who left Rome would perish at sea. They both had those predictions. Yeah, it's creepy.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's horrifying. But so you do it's really, the ending is heartbreaking but beautiful because the epilogue is sort of passing the baton on to Louisa May Alcott. And this impetus in this young girl to, I'm going to carry on the tradition of Margaret Fuller, and she does. But the sections at sea, when they actually do get on the ship, what was your in there considering? Was she sending letters back and forth from the ship? Or like, what was the documentation of her final days?
So Louisa May Alcott, as you said so beautifully, they passed the baton. she names the eldest sister in Little Women Margaret, after her mentor that she had grown up. And Jo is in many ways inspired by Margaret, the sister who leaves Concord and moves to New York and becomes a writer and does it on her own. So she really did pass the baton. But on the trip back, I had the same thought. I was like, this is fascinating. They wrote letters, and I'm like, but where were I don't know how the mail worked back
Packets,
then. But
ships, right?
I'm like, how was the mail getting there faster than you if you're both crossing the ocean at the same time? But that was weird because the posthumous letters arrived. So her family and Emerson had very detailed accountings of how they spent their days on the ship, and they talked about how she was trying to teach her husband English, and he in return was teaching the captain of the ship Italian, and they got sick, and then they were better, and she had seasickness, and then she was okay, and they really did talk about that. But then tragically, the captain passed away at sea, so it was a much less experienced first mate or whoever was in charge after the captain passed away, much less experienced sailor at the helm, and then the hurricane hits. And they run aground into a sandbar off of Fire Island, close enough that the people on the beach can hear their voices, and close enough that many on board the ship swam to safety. But Margaret, having had a phobia of water her entire life, and her husband not knowing how to swim, they didn't make a try for it. They tried to have someone swim their son to shore, and they did not make it. But so that is very well documented because people saw it and other people survived who had been on the ship with them. But what is so stunning about this return passage back is she had put out the firing volley of the argument for the women's right to vote very earlier in her career. She had written Woman in the 19th Century, which was a mega bestseller, and it was the first time that a woman was talking about women being able to enter the workforce, women being able to be educated like a man. She had the famous quote, "Let them be sea captains if that be their calling." She was saying, we are doing such a disservice to society by saying this is a man's job and this is a woman's job, and they are bifurcated and never the two shall meet. And she was saying, women, it's in everyone's best interest to let women have education and engage and take part and vote. And so she was a mentor to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She had been a tutor of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's. She was a mentor of Louisa May Alcott. Susan B. Anthony knew her and admired her. And all of these women who we know of their names as from the women's suffrage movement, they all saw her as their leader. So when Margaret is living basically in hiding in Florence after the Roman Revolution and is pondering her next move, and she has written this great book that she thought was the great work of her life, which was her book about her time in the Roman Revolution, she and her husband decided to come back to America. She thought she would have better chances of publishing this book in America, and they had just survived the Roman Revolution, but they could not go back to Rome, but they could not stay in Florence, so they decided to go back. And I don't know if they would have landed in New York or Boston, permanently, but they were on their way back. And the women in America who are preparing to hold the first ever convention for the National Women's Rights Movement are writing to her as she's in Italy saying, will you come and will you be the president of our convention? And so Margaret is sailing back in the summer of 1850, July, prepared to go to the convention in October, 2 months later. And so instead of taking the gavel and presiding over this opening convention of the women's rights movement with all these other figures who would rise up and we'd learn their names forever, instead the convention opens with a moment of silence in her honor. And to me, that was such a stunning and sort of chilling metaphor of her voice and her legacy and everything being silenced too soon. Her great book that she saw as the great book of her life being lost at sea, her life being lost at sea. And a lot of people ask me, why don't we know about Margaret Fuller when she did all of these things? First woman at Harvard, first foreign news correspondent, first female news editor, the inspiration for the Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne, XYZ. I think that is a huge, I think you can't understate just how tragically early the loss happened, but I also just think a lot of her peers and her contemporaries who we know so well, if you think about Thoreau, you know more about Thoreau because you're doing a book on him, but you think about Walden Pond. And if you think about Louisa May Alcott, you think about Little Women. And if you think about Hawthorne, you think about the Scarlet Letter, maybe the House of Seven Gables. But really, a lot of these people, I won't say one-hit wonders, but they had one big knock-it-out-of-the-park success that solidified their, like Herman Melville, Moby Dick, so, who was also part of the whole group of friends. One big work that solidified their place in the American canon. And when she was alive, she was more well-known than all of them. She was their editor. You know, she was the boss. But her work did not translate and live as long as these others did, and what she considered was the great work of her life was lost at sea. And so then as you have the 50s proceeding on, and you have these other women sort of stepping up to take the place at the forefront of the argument for women's rights and abolition, and these causes that you know Margaret would have been a trailblazer on, we lose out on seeing what she might have done. And so I think it was tragic.
To end, I want to thank you for the stories that you're choosing to tell and the way that you are telling them.
Thank you.
When Margaret goes to work for Horace Greeley, she says something that I think really perfectly reflects what you seem to be intent on doing. She says, I told Greeley when I began my work for him that I would be guided by 3 principles. The first is that I wish to tell the truth. The second, I wish to write what the public needs to know. And finally, I wish to write stories that will help us to bring about a better day for all.
Yeah, and that was true.
So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We can actually stay a little bit longer as a final session of the day because there's going to be a line at the valet. So if people want to hang out and have Q&A, we can do that. I have a quick, if you were sitting in on the Kristen Hanna sessions, I have a quick little fast 5 that I like to ask writers.
I love it. I love a fast 5. I'm also happy to sign and personalize after too, if that helps
yes,
you.
We're doing
then
that.
you don't
We'll
have to wait in the
too.
valet line. You can wait in the book line.
What's the book that made you a reader?
Oh my gosh, so great. There were a few. I would say The Chronicles of Narnia was like mind-blowing as a young reader.
Yeah.
The American Girl series.
Yes.
Felicity and Samantha and Addie and Molly.
Yes.
And then lots of Roald Dahl. Like I loved James and the Giant Peach, and I just remember the imagination.
Okay,
like, going
incredible.
wild.
What's your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book. So that's a really hard one, but I would say the one that I could just return to over and over again if I could only have one book would be War and Peace. I just think there's endless amounts of things in there to discover.
Yes, yes. What's a book that you think about often? So that lives rent-free in your head. Not necessarily the best, not necessarily, but...
The book that is always living rent-free in my head is honestly the one I'm working on. It's the one because then you asked at what point in the process do you begin writing? It's when she starts talking to me. Right. And I'm like reading about her on the page as a historical figure, and then she's living up here as an actual like living, breathing, talking figure. And that's when I know I'm ready to write, and that's really the one that's always living in my head.
You're like, talk to the page.
Yeah, come out. Leave me alone.
What are you reading now?
What am I reading now? I just started Tatiana de Rosnay, An Arc, which is an advanced reader's copy of her upcoming one called Blonde Dust, which is about the shooting of the Misfits in Reno, Nevada, Marilyn Monroe's last movie when she was there with Clark Gable and Montgomery Clift and Arthur Miller, and it's like the last days of this group of people, and it's in the desert, so I was like, I'm gonna bring it with me to Palm Springs, because otherwise I'll be sad to be reading about the warm desert in New York in February. So I'm gonna read it when I'm in the sun. So I'm reading, Tatiana de Rosnay wrote Sarah's Key, and she writes great historical fiction.
Nice, okay. What book do you wish you'd written?
Oh, North Woods by Daniel Mason. I do not understand how he did that. I don't understand how he took my brain on that journey. It was so original and unlike anything I had ever read, and it was such a delight, and I was just in awe of the language.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah. Okay, any questions? Yes, go ahead.
So I love your passion.
Thank you.
It's just bubbling out of you.
Thank you.
Talking about goosebumps.
I'll repeat the question, don't worry.
Big goosebumps. But so about 15 years ago, we went to Concord, and we're just getting to go into the hotel, the beautiful hotel, and somebody yells out, "It's haunted!" And my wife goes, "Cool!"
Yeah.
To where it's thrown for a while, right?
Yeah, the Colonial Inn,
I could
his
not
aunt's.
leave the freaking room. I wrote all night because he was just speaking to me. I went to Emerson's house. I went to Harvard. It's the most amazing journey that we took. Now, 15 years later, she has a new book coming out, and you're the heroine. I've never met you. When you read it, you go, what are they doing? That's me. I'm like freaked out listening to you because sitting at Walden Pond, so much came out. You can't sit there or be where they walked in the woods. Now, I don't know if Emerson said this or I just heard it. He said, if you want true wisdom, take a walk in the woods.
Yeah.
And I heard that, and so
Oh,
much
wow.
to the writing. So
That is
this
amazing.
book hasn't come out yet, but I'm going, oh, this is freaky.
Ooh,
This is
I
really
love
freaky.
that.
So we will have to share
I
it with
love
you when we
that.
go over
Yeah.
and speak to you.
Oh,
But,
I love that.
Man, everything you're saying is these, like, the aha moments we had 15 years ago. This look with us, and finally she goes, okay, I got to put, this person's speaking to me.
Oh,
Didn't
that's
know maybe
amazing.
It was you, but
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's
Maybe.
amazing. The spirits really are alive. And what I will say is when I went to the hotel, I got put in the Emerson suite, so I was thrilled. I was like, this is a good sign. But there are suites, there's no Margaret Fuller suite. And I noticed that over and over in Concord. You go to Author's Ridge, they're all buried. They are all hanging out for all of eternity together, except Margaret. And that's always kind of the sense I got, was she was a little bit outside of the clique because she was single, she was not married, she was not part of the fam, and she was a little bit even iconoclastic for them. But I was leaving that in, and there's a fife and drum colonial revolution, like militia being called up, and I was like, only in Concord. I just love that town.
Oh my God.
I love that
somebody
town.
have to speak at Harvard just because of these people.
Yeah.
You know, and then
Yeah.
about 3 weeks later,
It's amazing.
I applied to speak at Harvard.
Amazing.
And the only motivation was what I felt in Concord.
Oh, that's
Great.
beautiful.
Any
Concord is
other
really great.
questions? Oh, Jeff.
I'm really curious. In fiction,
Yeah.
you create somebody, you go through their life, and you kind of complete their life. You've spoken of this woman in such a powerful way. It's almost like having a neighbor that you, if they moved somewhere else, you'd want to move to the same place.
Yeah.
How do you let go
Oh, yeah.
of
Yeah.
that life?
Yeah.
Sort of put it away on the
Oh,
shelf
yeah.
and move on.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, the question for the historical record, i.e. the
Yeah.
live stream.
Yes.
Is how do you let go of the fictional characters that you've come to know so well, put them on the shelf and walk
Yeah.
away?
So you never really do. It's almost more just like having, each book is like having a child. Like people are like, what's your favorite book? I'm like, well, I could never pick a favorite
Right.
because it's a piece of you that is so just a product of you. And hopefully if places like the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival invite me, then I get to speak about them. But so it's really, when the book is out, I'm releasing control. I'm no longer managing what's happening on the page. This book is going to go out and have its own relationship with every single person who touches it and reads it, and I can't control that. But it, to me, feels like this dynamic living thing that is still out there, and I still have that relationship, and I'm still connecting with readers and talking about it and thinking about it. And every time I do something like this, someone asks a different question, or I'm able to think about it in a different way. So I don't really ever release it. But what does happen is this thing I call book lag, like jet lag, but for books. So I published Margaret Fuller a year ago. I am now knee deep in my research and writing for the next one, and I am all in on that one. And then I'm shifting gears if I'm going to talk about Margaret Fuller or Marjorie Post or a book that came out a long time ago. And so there does happen to be a little bit of that where you go all in for this intense period while you're writing, editing, copy editing, and launching, and then you move on to the next one. And so I don't really ever feel like I release it. I just feel like I release it in the sense that I'm no longer writing it, but it's launched out into the world and I'm still having a relationship with it, if that makes sense. I guess so. Passing the many lovers. I saw you raise your hand. Yeah.
Have you found your next
Oh, yes.
Have you found your next
yes.
woman?
And that's a great way to end, right?
Yeah.
Because every author has to plant that question. Evelyn Nesbit, she was the Gibson girl. She was sort of the first it girl in American society at the dawn of the 20th century. She was a Broadway star. She was an artist's muse. And she was really like the first celebrity in this incredible time where artists were working with young women and painting and doing the medium of paint. And then all of a sudden photography becomes this thing. And so the models switch over from being painted by artists like Charles Dana Gibson or Beckwith or Church to now all of a sudden being on every advertisement and on magazines and in the society pages, and really like the advent of this woman celebrity who is a model, who was an artist. And then she transitions from her career as an artist model to a Broadway star and becomes this sensation. She was like a prototype Marilyn Monroe. Every woman in America wanted to be her. Every man wanted to be with her. And she gets entangled, as often happened with these beautiful young women in this world of Broadway and New York society, with with some men who are all the men are madly in love with her, but she gets involved in this scandal that was known as the crime of the century when her husband shoots and murders her lover on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden in front of all of high society. And she
Hate when that happens.
And it was such a sensation that President Teddy Roosevelt had to ask the papers to stop printing about it. It was like a Princess Diana craze, Marilyn Monroe type of craze, where everybody was obsessed with her and with this story. So I'm telling her story. And it's called It Girl, because she was known as the first It Girl. And she kind of changed the paradigm of what it meant to be a famous young woman.
Exciting.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.